A Navy SEAL was just driving along the frozen shore of Lake Superior, expecting nothing more than a quiet road and a long night ahead. But his dog suddenly pulled him off the road, growling into the storm as if it sensed something no human could see. Moments later, they discovered a stranded mother and her 2 children, injured and trapped near an old lighthouse while the waves crashed against the rocks. What Gavin didn't know yet was that this rescue would uncover a secret someone had tried very hard to bury beneath the lake. And before the night was over, that same lighthouse would shine again, not as a warning, but as the only hope left for a family in danger. This is the story of a Navy SEAL, a loyal K-9, and the storm that brought their paths together for a reason. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more powerful stories. The road along Lake Superior looked almost unreal under the pale northern sun. The light so sharp it seemed to turn every stone and every ripple of water into polished steel. Gavin Rhodes drove slowly along the narrow highway that hugged the shoreline, the tires of his aging truck humming steadily against the cold pavement. Even with the heater running, the air that slipped through the vents still carried a bite of lake wind. Early spring in the Upper Peninsula had that strange quality, bright and clear but still edged with winter's teeth. Gavin Rhodes was 32, a U.S. Navy SEAL on temporary leave, the kind of man whose presence quietly filled a room without him needing to say much. His angular, rugged face and sharp jawline carried the look of someone who had spent years under pressure, but had learned to hold it without complaint. His cold, blue-gray eyes often appeared distant, as if they were always measuring distances and outcomes at the same time. His modern short undercut haircut was neat and precise, faded tightly along the sides with a short textured top, the kind of haircut that looked effortless but suggested discipline. The standard issue green digital camouflage uniform he wore fit him cleanly, blouse fully buttoned, trousers tucked neatly into plain black combat boots. A simple black belt was the only accessory he allowed himself. There were no patches, no tactical vest, no weapons, nothing that would immediately scream soldier to a stranger. But the posture gave it away. Upright, steady, alert without seeming tense. Beside him sat Argo. The Belgian Malinois K9 was 4 years old, full-grown and lean with the tight, muscular build of a working dog that had never known laziness. His coat ran deep fawn into rich mahogany tones with a distinct black facial mask that sharpened the lines of his intelligent face. His ears stood upright like antennae catching signals from the world around them. His dark amber eyes held a focus that rarely wandered. Argo didn't move much while the truck drove. He simply sat upright on the passenger seat, steady and alert, facing the same direction as Gavin, as if the road ahead belonged to both of them. They had spent years together in training operations where instinct and silence has mattered more than conversation. Gavin often said Argo didn't follow commands. He followed intention. Today, however, the drive felt strangely quiet. Gavin had received the letter 3 weeks earlier. His uncle's lighthouse on the northern shore of Lake Superior had been left to him. The man had been a retired Coast Guard keeper who preferred solitude over company, and Gavin had not seen him in nearly 8 years. The inheritance had felt strange, almost accidental, but the legal paperwork had been clear. The lighthouse was now his. The shoreline curved gently ahead, revealing another stretch of jagged rock where waves broke in white flashes against the dark stone. Tall pines leaned toward the lake as if the wind had slowly trained them over decades. There were no towns nearby, only scattered logging roads and old service trails that cut toward the shore. Then Argo moved. It wasn't dramatic. The dog's posture changed first, the subtle shift of muscle under his coat. His ears angled forward, his nose lifted slightly into the air. Then he gave a low, almost questioning sound in his throat. Gavin glanced over. "What is it, boy?" Argo leaned forward toward the windshield, eyes narrowing. The Malinois suddenly stood up on the seat. A second later, he placed both front paws against the dashboard and stared toward a narrow gravel turnoff Gavin almost missed. The road was little more than a worn track, cutting down toward the rocky shoreline. Argo whined once, short, sharp. Gavin slowed the truck. The signal bars on his phone flickered down to one weak line before disappearing completely. Dead zone. He frowned slightly. This stretch of coast was notorious for patchy service, but the sudden drop felt abrupt. Argo barked once. Gavin sighed softly and turned the wheel. The truck left the highway and rolled onto the narrow gravel track. Loose stones crunched beneath the tires as they descended toward the lake. The wind grew louder the lower they went, carrying the smell of cold water and thawing earth. The track curved around a ridge of rock and suddenly opened into a rough clearing near the shoreline. That was when Gavin saw the car. A gray sedan sat tilted awkwardly, half off the path, its front wheel buried in a deep rut of mud and melting snow. One door stood open. Beside it stood a woman. She looked exhausted. Nora Whitman was in her early 30s, a tall but slender woman whose posture suggested stubborn resilience more than strength. Her shoulder-length chestnut hair had come loose from a ponytail and whipped around her face in the wind. Her pale skin had the faint, uneven color of someone who had been outside too long in cold air. She wore a dark wool coat over jeans and winter boots dusted with mud and slush. Even from a distance, Gavin could see the tight control in her expression, the quiet determination of someone refusing to panic for the sake of others. Two children stood close to her legs. The older girl, Maya, looked about 9. She had long, dark blonde hair pulled into a messy braid and a round, freckled face that carried the anxious seriousness of a child trying to act brave. Her thick jacket looked slightly oversized, and she clutched the sleeve of her mother's coat with stiff fingers. The younger boy, Eli, was 6 and smaller than his sister. His sandy hair flattened beneath a knit cap that had slipped halfway over one eye. His cheeks were flushed bright red from the wind, and he shivered despite the layers he wore. Argo was already moving before Gavin had fully parked. The Malinois jumped down from the truck and trotted toward the group with calm, purposeful steps. Nora's body tensed immediately. Then she saw the dog's posture. Argo didn't charge or bark. Instead, he circled slightly and positioned himself between the children and the wind coming off the lake. Maya blinked. "He's blocking the wind," she whispered. Eli stopped shivering for a moment, surprised. Gavin stepped out of the truck. "You all right?" he called. Nora nodded once, though the exhaustion in her shoulders said otherwise. "We slid off the road about an hour ago," she said. "Tried digging the tire out, but the ground's half ice under the mud." Her voice was steady but thin with fatigue. Gavin crouched beside the tire and studied the rut. It was deeper than it looked. "Tow truck?" No signal. Gavin glanced at his phone again. Still dead. He stood up. "The nearest town's 25 miles back," he said. "Lighthouse up the coast about 3 miles from here. It's heated." Nora hesitated, protective instinct flickering across her face. Maya looked down at Argo. The dog had settled beside Eli, body angled so the boy sat within the shelter of his flank. "Mom," Maya whispered, "the dog's nice." Nora looked at Gavin again. His calm expression didn't change. "We'll just warm up tonight," he said. "Morning, we figure the rest out." She nodded slowly. "Okay." They packed quickly. The children climbed into the truck's back seat, while Nora sat beside them. Argo returned to the passenger seat without needing instruction. The truck rolled slowly back up the gravel track, about halfway up the hill. Argo froze again. His ears rose sharply. Gavin followed the direction of the dog's gaze. In the thin layer of snow along the road were tire tracks, fresh ones. They ran parallel to the path for several yards before disappearing into the trees. Gavin frowned. Someone else had driven this road recently, but the tracks weren't there when he turned down from the highway, which meant someone had come through after him, or had been waiting nearby. He said nothing. Instead, he kept driving. Ahead, the distant white tower of the lighthouse began to rise above the trees, bright against the cold blue sky. Behind them, the tire tracks slowly vanished beneath drifting snow, and far down the shoreline road, another vehicle engine quietly turned off. The lighthouse stood alone on the rocky rise, like something carved out of stubbornness and salt wind. When Gavin Rhodes parked the truck near the weathered wooden outbuilding beside the tower, the sun was already sliding lower over Lake Superior, casting long, pale beams across the frozen shoreline. Up close, the lighthouse felt older than the road that led to it. The white paint on the tower had faded into uneven layers where years of storms had stripped and scarred it. The main keeper's house attached to the base looked sturdy but worn, its cedar boards darkened by decades of cold wind and lake spray. Gavin stepped out first, his boots crunching on frozen gravel. Argo jumped down beside him immediately, the Belgian Malinois moving with the quiet efficiency of a trained working dog. The dog paused, lifting his nose to test the air. The wind came from the lake in sharp, steady gusts. His upright ears twitched once, but the dog did not bark. "Come on," Gavin said calmly. Inside, the keeper's house smelled like old wood, dust, and faint oil from the heating system. The interior was larger than Gavin expected. Tall windows lined the lake-facing wall, their glass slightly warped with age. The late sunlight streamed in at a sharp angle, turning the room into a pattern of warm light and long shadows. Gavin moved quickly, instinctively shifting into the practical rhythm that came from years of emergency training. He turned the thermostat up, checked the old cast-iron heater to make sure it still worked, then brought blankets from a storage chest near the stairs. "Sit down," he told the children gently. Maya obeyed first. The 9-year-old girl perched on the edge of a chair, trying to look braver than she felt. Her freckled face had regained a little color now that the wind was gone. Eli climbed onto the couch, still shivering slightly. His small body curled under the blanket, Gavin wrapped around him. Nora Whitman remained standing for a moment, as if her body had forgotten how to relax. Up close, Gavin could see how tired she really was. She was tall, but slender, the kind of thinness that came from weeks of stress rather than natural build. Her chestnut hair hung loose around her shoulders, and there were faint shadows under her hazel eyes. Still, there was something steady about the way she held herself. She wasn't fragile. She was simply worn down. "Water's on the stove," Gavin said quietly, filling a kettle. She nodded once. "Thank you." Argo settled near the couch beside Eli. The boy stared at the dog with quiet fascination. "Does he always look like he's thinking?" Eli asked softly. Gavin glanced over. "Pretty much." Argo shifted slightly so the boy leaned comfortably against his flank, the dog instinctively placing his body between the child and the cold draft near the window. The kettle began to whistle softly. For a few minutes, the room was filled only with the sounds of the heater clicking and the wind outside pushing against the old glass. Then Gavin's phone vibrated on the wooden counter. The signal had returned. He frowned slightly and answered. "Rhodes." The voice on the other end was clear and composed. "Mr. Rhodes, this is Paige Holloway." Gavin straightened a little. Paige Holloway was the estate attorney responsible for the lighthouse property. Her voice carried the precise calm of someone who had spent decades speaking carefully in legal offices and quiet courtrooms. She was in her mid-50s, a disciplined woman with sharp dark eyes and steel-gray hair usually tied into a tight bun at the back of her head. Her posture, even when seated, had the straight-backed confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime defending clients against pressure. "I wanted to confirm you've reached the property safely," she said. "I have." "Good. And your uncle left specific instructions I was asked to deliver once you arrived." Gavin glanced toward Nora and the children. "Go ahead." There was a brief pause on the line. "Your uncle believed that someone might eventually come looking for something hidden on the property." Gavin's expression didn't change. "What kind of something?" He never said, but he made one point extremely clear. Paige's voice lowered slightly. "If anyone comes asking about documents or storage items from the lighthouse, you are not to trust them." Gavin leaned slightly against the counter. "Why?" "Because," Paige replied carefully, "your uncle believed those people were the same ones who tried to ruin him 20 years ago." Gavin absorbed that quietly. Paige continued. "He attempted to report the matter at the time. The case was buried. He believed powerful people were involved. The lighthouse was left to you because he trusted you would know how to handle unexpected situations." Gavin glanced toward Argo. The dog had lifted his head. "I see," Gavin said. Paige's voice softened slightly. "He also told me to say something else. If trouble finds you, the lighthouse was designed, with more than one way, to protect what's inside." The call ended. Gavin stood still for a moment. Across the room, Nora watched him carefully. "What did she say?" He poured the hot water into mugs. "Your turn," he said calmly. Nora hesitated, then she exhaled slowly. "My husband worked at the Harbor Survey Office," she said quietly, "mapping cargo traffic and shoreline infrastructure." Her voice trembled slightly before steadying again. 6 months ago, he died in what they called a boating accident." Maya looked down at her hands. Nora continued. "Before he died, he gave me a box of documents, said if anything happened to him, I shouldn't let anyone take it." Gavin's gaze sharpened slightly. "And 3 days ago," Nora said quietly, "I started getting anonymous messages." "What kind?" She swallowed. "The last one said, 'Tonight they will come.'" Silence settled in the room. Argo suddenly stood up. The dog moved slowly toward the front door. His nose hovered inches above the floor mat. Then a low growl rumbled deep in his chest, not loud, but unmistakable. Gavin watched him carefully. Argo sniffed again. The dog's lips curled slightly. Gasoline. Or solvent. Something chemical. Something that didn't belong on a quiet shoreline road. Gavin stepped closer. Then his eyes moved to the canvas bag Nora had carried inside. "May I?" She nodded. He examined the seams carefully. Nothing obvious, but when he pressed gently along the inner lining, something small and hard shifted beneath the fabric. Gavin reached into the lining and pulled out a small device the size of a coin, a GPS tracker. He turned it over once in his fingers. Someone had planted it, which meant whoever wanted the documents didn't just know Nora was traveling. They knew exactly where she was. Nora's face went pale. "Oh my God!" Argo suddenly turned his head toward the windows. Outside, the sun had almost reached the horizon. The room dimmed quickly, as clouds drifted across the lake. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. The heater clicked off. The entire house went dark. For a second, no one spoke. Only the wind could be heard. Then, a faint metallic sound came from outside the side door. A slow testing movement, like someone gently touching the secondary lock. Gavin stood completely still. Argo's ears locked forward. The dog didn't bark. He simply stared at the door, waiting. Morning in the harbor town felt deceptively peaceful. The sunlight over Lake Superior was bright and sharp, reflecting off the steel-blue water, and the small fishing boats rocking gently along the docks. The town itself was modest, just a handful of brick storefronts, a marina, a bait shop, and a weather-beaten municipal building that served as both town hall and police station. To anyone passing through, it would have looked like a place where nothing serious ever happened. Gavin Rhodes parked his truck near the harbor office. The cold wind carried the smell of lake water, diesel fuel, and old timber from the docks. Argo sat upright in the passenger seat, the Belgian Malinois watching the street with the same focused calm he carried everywhere. His lean, muscular body remained still, ears upright, dark amber eyes quietly tracking movement. Inside the small police office, a tall man stood behind the front desk reviewing paperwork. Deputy Carter Shaw was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and solidly built, the kind of man who looked like he had spent most of his life outdoors rather than behind a desk. His sandy blonde hair was cut short and practical, and his square jaw carried a permanent shadow of stubble that suggested he shaved when he remembered to. His eyes were gray and observant but not suspicious by nature. People in small towns trusted him because he wasn't dramatic, and he didn't talk more than necessary. He looked up when Gavin entered. "You Gavin Rhodes?" Gavin nodded. A state lawyer called ahead. Carter extended his hand. His handshake was firm but not confrontational. "You're the lighthouse inheritor." Something like that. Carter glanced briefly at Argo. "That your dog?" "K9, partner." Carter studied the Malinois for a moment. Argo simply stared back calmly. "Looks smarter than most people I deal with," Carter said dryly. They moved to a small office near the back of the building. Through the window, behind Carter's desk, the harbor could be seen stretching across the cold morning light. Gavin placed the map and notebook from the lighthouse on the desk. Carter read silently for a few minutes. Finally, he leaned back. "Your uncle filed a report about this wreck 20 years ago. You know about it." Carter nodded slowly. "Officially, it was classified as an environmental false alarm. Unofficially?" Carter rubbed his chin. "There were rumors." "What kind?" "That something in the wreck cargo shouldn't have been there." Gavin didn't react outwardly, but the information settled heavily in the room. Carter continued. "The investigation stalled because nobody could prove contamination. No samples, no verified leak." Gavin tapped the notebook. "My uncle thought otherwise." Carter nodded again. "Maybe he did. But without hard evidence, cases like that disappear." He paused before adding quietly, "Still doesn't explain your visitor last night." Before Gavin could respond, the front office door opened. A tall man stepped inside, accompanied by another figure in a dark suit. The tall man carried himself with polished confidence. Gordon Kessler was in his early 50s. Broad-shouldered but slightly heavy from comfortable wealth rather than physical work. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed back, and his face carried the controlled smile of someone who had spent decades negotiating deals. His navy wool coat looked expensive but understated. Beside him stood his lawyer, Victor Delaney. Delaney was thin, sharply dressed, and precise in the way only career attorneys could be. His narrow face was framed by perfectly trimmed dark hair and rectangular glasses. His expression held the quiet calculation of someone who rarely entered a room without already planning 3 possible outcomes. Kessler smiled pleasantly. "Deputy Shaw." Carter's expression did not change. "Morning, Gordon." Kessler's gaze shifted toward Gavin. "And this must be Mr. Rhodes." His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I own Superior Expedition Salvage," he said smoothly. "We operate several dive charters and exploration tours around the lake." Gavin said nothing. Delaney stepped forward slightly. "We're here regarding a matter of stolen property." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Stolen?" Delaney nodded toward Nora, who had remained seated quietly near the hallway bench. Nora Whitman looked tense but composed. In the daylight, her exhaustion was more visible. Her pale skin contrasted against the dark coat she wore, and faint stress lines showed near her eyes, but her posture remained upright. Delaney spoke in an even tone. "The documents currently in Ms. Whitman's possession belong to Mr. Kessler's salvage company. We have reason to believe they were removed illegally by her late husband." The words landed heavily. Nora's eyes widened slightly. "That's not true." Kessler sighed gently. "I'm not accusing you personally, Miss Whitman, but we are filing for temporary legal custody of the materials until ownership can be determined." Delaney added calmly, "And given the unstable circumstances surrounding the children's welfare, we may also request an emergency guardianship review until the matter is settled." Nora's face turned pale. Carter leaned forward. "That's a family court matter." "Correct," Delaney said smoothly, "but we're preparing the paperwork." The room grew colder despite the sunlight through the window. Gavin studied Kessler carefully. The man's calm smile never faltered. This was not a threat shouted in anger. This was a legal trap built patiently. Carter finally spoke. "Without proof of theft, the documents remain with the widow." Delaney adjusted his glasses. "For now." Kessler gave a polite nod and turned toward the door. "We'll let the courts decide." The two men left as quietly as they had arrived. For a moment, no one spoke. Carter exhaled slowly. "That man never does anything without paperwork ready." Later that evening, the wind had picked up again around the lighthouse. The sky darkened early as clouds rolled in from the lake. Inside, Nora prepared simple food while Maya and Eli sat near the table. Argo lay quietly beside them, the Malinois occasionally lifting his head whenever the wind rattled the windows. Gavin stood near the back door, checking the locks. The lighthouse property felt different at night. The isolation was heavier. Argo's head suddenly lifted. The dog stood silently. Then he walked across the room and positioned himself between the kitchen and the rear hallway. His body became completely still, not barking, not growling, just blocking the passage. Gavin immediately understood. Someone was inside the house. A faint movement sounded from the rear storage area. A shadow slipped across the hallway wall. Gavin stepped sideways, keeping distance. "Easy," he said quietly. Argo held his ground. The intruder froze. Then the back door burst open and the figure ran. Footsteps pounded across the gravel outside. Headlights flashed briefly from the road beyond the trees. A patrol vehicle turned sharply into the driveway. Deputy Carter Shaw stepped out with a flashlight. The intruder vanished into the darkness before he could be caught. But something had fallen during the escape. A plastic access badge, and a pair of rubber gloves that carried the faint chemical smell Argo had reacted to earlier. Carter examined the badge under the flashlight. "Harbor access permit," he said quietly. He looked at Gavin. "I can get a warrant now." Gavin met his gaze. "For what?" Carter's voice dropped. "For Kessler's salvage docks." He paused. "But I'll need to prove imminent danger." The wind howled across the lake outside. "And we've only got a small window before the paperwork disappears." The harbor town felt different under the heavy sky. The clear northern light from the previous day had faded into a gray tension that rolled in from Lake Superior, like a warning. Cold wind swept through the marina and rattled the metal rigging on the docked fishing boats. The water itself had darkened, the waves moving faster now, pushing against the wooden piers with restless force. Inside the small police station, Deputy Carter Shaw stood at his desk reviewing documents spread across a stack of legal forms. The man's practical gray eyes moved carefully between the pages, and the permanent crease in his brow suggested the weight of responsibility he carried. Carter had always believed that the law worked best when it moved slowly and carefully. But today he could feel time pressing from all sides. Gavin Rhodes stood near the office window watching the harbor through the glass. His disciplined posture remained steady, the lines of his angular, rugged face calm but focused. The standard-issue green digital camouflage uniform he wore made him look slightly out of place inside the quiet municipal building. Yet his presence felt grounded rather than aggressive. Argo sat beside him, the Belgian Malinois upright and attentive, his lean, muscular frame alert as his dark amber eyes quietly scanned the room and the doorway beyond. Carter set his pen down and leaned back slightly. "This might actually work," he said. Gavin turned. "What might work?" Carter tapped the paperwork. "Emergency search warrant. Environmental hazard clause." He explained slowly, thinking through each word as if building the argument in real time. "We've got a reported chemical smell near the lighthouse property, documented trespassing, and a tracking device planted on private property. If I combine those with the possibility of an unreported salvage operation near an old wreck site, the judge might sign it." Gavin nodded slightly. The logic made sense. Yes, it wasn't enough to accuse Gordon Kessler outright, but it created legal grounds to investigate the salvage docks before whatever operation Kessler planned could move forward. Carter continued. "The judge in Marquette handles emergency environmental warrants sometimes. If I submit the request now, I might get approval by evening." Gavin glanced toward the harbor again. "You think Kessler's moving tonight?" Carter shook his head slowly. "Tomorrow, but he's preparing something now. That's why the timing matters." Outside, the sky grew darker. By the time Gavin drove back toward the lighthouse, the wind had picked up sharply. Nora Whitman sat quietly in the passenger seat beside the children, watching the waves crash against the rocks along the road. Her slender figure seemed smaller beneath the heavy coat she wore, but her hazel eyes carried the steady determination of someone who had already endured too much to panic easily. Maya leaned against the window, watching the water while Eli sat beside Argo in the back seat, occasionally resting his small hand against the dog's neck. Argo tolerated the contact calmly, occasionally flicking his ears at the rising wind. The lighthouse appeared again above the trees as the truck climbed the narrow gravel path toward the rocky rise. But before Gavin could reach the house, the first thunder rolled across the lake. It was strange to hear thunder in cold weather, but storms on Superior followed their own rules. Dark clouds gathered quickly, turning the afternoon sky into a low ceiling of shifting gray. By late afternoon, the storm was fully alive. Wind tore across the rocks and waves crashed higher along the shoreline. Gavin stood near the edge of the cliff path, examining the lake with careful attention. The marker Argo had found earlier was now nearly invisible beneath the shifting shadows of storm clouds, but Gavin remembered exactly where it had been. Something about the coordinates still bothered him. Nora stepped outside with Maya and Eli, wrapping her coat tighter against the wind. "Do storms come this fast here?" she asked. Gavin nodded once. Superior builds weather fast. Carter's patrol truck appeared on the road below the hill about 10 minutes later. The deputy stepped out, his jacket flapping violently in the wind. "Judge, sign the warrant," he said, raising his voice above the gusts. Relief crossed Gavin's face briefly, but Carter added another piece of news that dimmed the moment. Kessler filed legal action tonight, claiming Nora is holding stolen property connected to his salvage permits. Nora stiffened slightly but didn't speak. Carter continued. "It's not a full arrest order yet, but the county prosecutor wants to question her." At that moment, the storm shifted violently. A sudden burst of wind tore across the rocks, sending spray from the crashing waves up the cliffside. Eli, startled by the noise and movement, stepped backward too quickly. His small boot slipped on wet stone, and he stumbled toward the edge. Nora shouted his name. Gavin moved instantly, but Argo was already faster. The Belgian Malinois lunged forward and caught the back of Eli's coat between his teeth, bracing his muscular body low against the rock. The dog didn't pull roughly. He simply anchored himself and held the child in place long enough for Gavin to reach them. Gavin grabbed Eli and pulled him safely back from the edge. The boy began shaking as the shock settled in, but Argo released the coat and nudged the child gently with his nose, as if checking that he was safe. Nora dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her son, her voice breaking slightly with relief. The storm continued raging around them, but for a moment the small group stood close together in silence. As the thunder rolled again across the lake, Argo suddenly turned his head toward the water. The dog's ears lifted sharply, and his body became still, staring across the dark waves. Gavin followed his gaze. Far out on the lake, barely visible through the shifting rain, a faint mechanical light flickered briefly on the horizon, then vanished. It wasn't a fishing boat. It moved too slowly, too deliberately, and its light cut through the storm like a searching signal before disappearing again. Argo remained focused on the same point long after the light was gone, as if memorizing the direction. Gavin felt the quiet certainty settle in his mind. Whatever Kessler planned, it involved the lake tonight, not tomorrow. By evening, the storm had weakened slightly, but the legal situation had worsened. Carter received a call from the county prosecutor while standing in the lighthouse kitchen. His face hardened as he listened. "They want Nora brought in tonight for questioning," he said after ending the call. Nora stood very still. "Is that an arrest?" she asked quietly. Carter shook his head. "Temporary detainment for investigation." Gavin looked toward the children sitting at the table with Argo. Eli had calmed down, and Maya was quietly reading from a book she had found on the lighthouse shelf. The calm, domestic scene contrasted painfully with the legal pressure closing in around them. Carter lowered his voice. "I'll keep it short, but the paperwork's already moving." Another vehicle approached the lighthouse road shortly after sunset. The headlights revealed a tall, narrow-shouldered man stepping out of a county patrol car. Sergeant Blake Runnels looked like someone who had spent years under stress and sleep deprivation. He was in his late 40s with sharp cheekbones and thinning dark hair combed back too carefully. His uniform fit loosely, and his eyes carried a tired hardness that suggested both experience and frustration. Rumor around town said Blake had accumulated gambling debts years earlier, though nothing had ever been proven officially. The way he avoided looking directly at Gavin hinted that the rumors might not be entirely wrong. "Evening," Blake said stiffly. "Ms. Whitman, I'll need you to come with me." Nora nodded quietly and turned to Maya and Eli. She knelt to speak softly with them, before standing again. Carter watched Blake carefully, but said nothing. The legal process had begun. Before leaving, Nora turned toward Gavin. "Take care of them," she said quietly. Gavin nodded once. "I will." Later that night, Gavin drove Maya and Eli to Carter Shaw's house on the quiet edge of town. Carter's wife had already prepared a small room where the children could stay safely, surrounded by neighbors who would notice immediately if anyone suspicious appeared. The decision wasn't easy, but it was the safest choice. By the time Gavin returned to the lighthouse alone with Argo, the storm clouds were finally breaking apart over the lake. Moonlight slipped between the moving clouds, illuminating the restless water below. Near midnight, Gavin's phone vibrated with a message. The number was unknown. The text was short. "Court in the morning," it read. Another line followed seconds later. "Lake in the afternoon." Gavin stared at the message. There was no signature, but he didn't need one. Morning arrived with a strange calm after the night storm. The sky above Lake Superior had cleared into a pale steel blue, but the air still carried the restless aftermath of heavy weather. Waves rolled slower now, though the lake remained unsettled, pushing white foam across the dark rocks along the shoreline. Gavin Rhodes stood near the lighthouse truck as the engine idled, his posture upright and composed. The disciplined stillness of the Navy SEAL made him appear almost carved from the same rugged landscape surrounding the tower. His angular, rugged face showed little emotion, Yet the cold, blue-gray eyes beneath his short undercut haircut revealed a mind moving quickly beneath the surface. Argo sat beside the driver's door, the Belgian Malinois K9, poised and attentive. The dog's lean, muscular body held the quiet readiness of an animal trained through countless hours of work beside his handler. His deep fawn-to-mahogany coat caught the early sunlight, while his black facial mask sharpened the intensity of his dark amber eyes. When Carter Shaw's patrol truck appeared on the road below the lighthouse hill, Argo rose without a sound and watched it approach. Deputy Carter Shaw stepped out carrying a folded warrant envelope and a thermos of coffee. The broad-shouldered deputy looked as though he had slept very little, his sandy hair pushed roughly back from his forehead. Still, his steady gray eyes held determination rather than fatigue. "Judge signed it at dawn," he said, handing Gavin the paperwork briefly before tucking it back into the folder. "Environmental inspection and property search at Kessler's salvage warehouse. We move now before they clear anything out." Gavin nodded once. The plan was simple. Carter would execute the warrant legally, while Gavin remained present as a witness regarding the trespassing incident and the tracker evidence. Sergeant Blake Runnels arrived minutes later, in another patrol vehicle. Blake's tall, thin figure stepped from the car with a stiffness that made him appear uncomfortable in the cold wind. His narrow face carried the same tired expression as the night before, though today his eyes seemed sharper, almost calculating. He greeted Carter curtly, before glancing briefly at Gavin and Argo, then turning his gaze toward the harbor road without speaking. The salvage dock sat on the far edge of town where a wide concrete warehouse overlooked the marina. A metal sign reading Superior Expedition Salvage hung above the entrance, its polished lettering designed to impress tourists and investors rather than fishermen. Carter approached the locked doors with professional calm and knocked firmly. When no one answered after several seconds, he held up the warrant for the camera mounted above the doorway before ordering Blake to open the door with the department key. The interior of the warehouse smelled immediately of fuel, salt water, and chemical solvent. Large metal racks held diving gear, cables, and compressed air tanks. A motorized crane sat near the loading bay where salvage equipment could be lowered onto vessels waiting outside. Carter began moving carefully through the building, documenting everything with photographs. Gavin stayed a few steps behind, watching quietly while Argo moved slowly along the concrete floor, nose low, absorbing every scent drifting through the air. It did not take long to notice the irregularity. Along the far wall, several barrels stood near a portable pump system. Carter crouched beside one barrel and wiped a small line of liquid from the concrete. The smell was faint but unmistakable. "Solvent residue," he said quietly. "Could be used for cleaning equipment or masking other chemicals." Gavin nodded. Nearby, several full diving suits hung beside an inflatable boat motor and a stack of underwater lighting rigs. All of it appeared prepared for immediate deployment. Carter photographed the arrangement carefully. "They were planning a dive operation soon," he murmured. "Too organized for a casual tour." Meanwhile, Argo had moved toward a wooden section of flooring at the rear of the warehouse. The dog paused, sniffed, then circled twice before lowering his body and pawing lightly at the boards. Gavin recognized the signal instantly. Argo had found something. Carter joined them and pried up the loose panel with a crowbar from the equipment rack. Beneath the floor lay a shallow storage cavity lined with waterproof plastic sheeting. Inside rested a weathered black dry bag sealed tightly with heavy clips. Carter pulled it out carefully. The bag was surprisingly heavy for its size. When he opened it, the contents revealed a small waterproof case containing a USB drive and 2 memory cards. Gavin watched as Carter inserted the USB drive into a laptop from the patrol vehicle. A video file opened immediately. Grainy footage appeared on the screen, showing divers working near a submerged wreck. A metal container was visible on the lake bed, cracked open with a dark plume drifting slowly upward in the water. A man's voice could be heard over the diver's radio feed. The voice was calm, authoritative, unmistakable. Gordon Kessler. The recording captured fragments of conversation about containment, timing, and the need to clear the site before the state inspector's notice. Carter's expression hardened. "This qualifies as environmental endangerment," he said, "and obstruction." Gavin glanced toward Blake Runnels. The sergeant stood near the entrance, watching silently, his posture stiff. As Carter began securing the evidence, Argo suddenly turned his head toward Blake. The dog's ears lifted sharply, and his body stiffened in a way Gavin recognized instantly. Not aggressive, but alert to something wrong. Blake shifted slightly where he stood, his hand resting casually near the pocket of his jacket. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Argo took one silent step forward and stared directly at him. The look held a strange intensity, almost as if the dog recognized a scent connected to the previous break-ins. Blake cleared his throat and turned away quickly, pretending to examine the equipment racks. Gavin said nothing, but the brief exchange planted a quiet suspicion that did not fade. The warehouse search continued for another 30 minutes. Carter carefully cataloged the waterproof bag and its contents according to chain of custody procedure. Blake offered to transport the evidence to the station, but Carter shook his head politely. "I'll handle the transfer myself," he said, sealing the bag in a labeled container. Blake's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not argue. Outside, the wind had strengthened again, pushing whitecaps across the harbor. As Carter finished his final photographs, a sudden noise erupted near the loading dock. A black pickup truck roared into the lot, braking hard beside the warehouse. Two men jumped out and sprinted toward the open door. Their movements were quick but clumsy compared to trained officers. "Stop!" Carter shouted. The men hesitated only long enough to see the sealed evidence case in Carter's hands before rushing forward. The chase that followed lasted barely 30 seconds, but felt far longer. One of the men grabbed the evidence container and bolted toward the truck. Gavin moved instinctively, but did not strike or tackle. Instead, he cut off the man's path, forcing him to change direction toward the marina walkway, where several fishermen were unloading nets nearby. The presence of witnesses slowed the intruder's escape. Argo sprinted ahead and planted himself squarely in the man's path, standing rigid without attacking. The sudden appearance of the Malinois startled the thief just long enough for Carter to catch up and wrench the container back from his hands. The second intruder had already fled toward the truck, which screeched away along the harbor road moments later. Carter exhaled sharply, clutching the sealed bag. "Attempted evidence theft," he said grimly. "That alone will interest the state investigators." Within the hour, the evidence had been transferred into a locked case and logged with the State Environmental Response Unit through Carter's secure channel. Gavin accompanied him back toward the lighthouse road as the afternoon light began to soften across the water. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Carter's phone rang. He listened quietly, his expression tightening with each passing second. When he ended the call, he looked toward the lake with grim understanding. "Kessler's salvage crew launched early," he said. "They're already heading toward the wreck site." Gavin frowned. "Earlier than the permit?" Carter nodded slowly. "They used the storm damage as an excuse to move fast." He paused, glancing toward the darkening water. "If they reach that wreck before the state team gets there." He didn't finish the sentence. Gavin already understood. Out on Lake Superior, the horizon stretched wide and empty beneath the fading sun. Somewhere beyond the shifting waves, Kessler's crew was racing toward the wreck, and toward whatever secret still waited on the lake bed. Morning light spread across the harbor town, with a quiet clarity that felt almost unreal after the tension of the previous days. The courthouse stood at the edge of the town square, a square brick building built sometime in the 1940s, its tall windows reflecting the cold blue sky over Lake Superior. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paperwork. The benches were half filled with townspeople, reporters from a regional paper, and a handful of fishermen who had come simply because rumors had spread quickly through the harbor community. At the front of the courtroom stood Nora Whitman. She looked calmer than she had at any point since Gavin first found her on the snowy roadside. Her slender frame was upright despite the strain she had endured, and she wore a borrowed navy coat over a simple gray blouse. Her chestnut brown hair was tied loosely behind her neck, a few strands falling around her pale but determined face. Her hazel eyes moved carefully between the judge's bench and the attorney standing beside her. The attorney was Denise Powell, a legal aid lawyer from the County Public Defense Office. Denise was a woman in her early 40s with a composed demeanor that suggested years of navigating difficult cases. She had warm brown skin, short, tightly curled hair, and intelligent eyes behind narrow reading glasses. Her posture was calm but firm, and her voice carried the kind of confidence that came from believing deeply in fairness rather than theatrics. Across the aisle sat Gordon Kessler, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that looked almost too polished for the small-town courtroom. Gordon was in his early 50s, tall with a narrow face and carefully combed silver hair that framed sharp, calculating features. His expression held the smooth politeness of a man used to winning arguments through influence rather than truth. Beside him sat his private attorney, quietly flipping through documents while whispering occasional comments into Gordon's ear. Gordon's strategy was obvious from the beginning. He intended to portray Nora not as a whistleblower, but as an unstable former employee who had stolen corporate documents and endangered her own children during a reckless escape attempt. Denise Powell stood and addressed the court with calm precision. "Your Honor," she began, "the narrative presented by Mr. Kessler is not only misleading, it deliberately ignores substantial evidence already secured through lawful investigation." She turned and nodded toward Deputy Carter Shaw, who sat near the back of the courtroom, beside Gavin Rhodes. Gavin remained silent as always. His broad, disciplined frame filled the wooden bench, his green digital camouflage uniform, drawing curious glances from several people nearby. He had chosen not to speak unless necessary. The story was no longer about him. Argo lay calmly at his feet beneath the bench, the Belgian Malinois resting but still alert, his ears occasionally flicking toward the doors whenever someone entered or left the room. Carter Shaw stood when Denise called him forward. The deputy described the warrant, the salvage warehouse search, and the evidence recovered from the waterproof bag. The courtroom projector flickered on as the USB drive's contents were displayed. Grainy underwater footage showed divers near the submerged wreck, while a container released a dark plume drifting into the surrounding water. Then, the voice played through the speakers, Gordon Kessler, giving instructions about clearing the site before state inspectors could intervene. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Gordon's polished expression tightened slightly for the first time. Denise continued carefully. "This evidence demonstrates not only environmental contamination, but also deliberate attempts to silence witnesses." She then addressed Sergeant Blake Runnels, who had been summoned as part of the investigation. Blake looked uncomfortable under the courtroom lights. His thin frame slouched slightly in the witness chair, and the tired tension in his narrow face became more visible with every question. Denise calmly introduced financial records showing Blake had accumulated significant personal debt over the last 2 years. When she played an audio clip recovered from the USB drive, referencing cooperation inside the department, Blake's composure finally cracked. The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. "Sergeant Runnels, you are suspended from involvement in this matter pending further review." The courtroom air shifted instantly. Gordon's legal strategy had begun to collapse. Rehook moment. At that moment, Argo lifted his head from the floor and turned slowly toward the courthouse windows. The movement was subtle, but deliberate. Gavin followed the dog's gaze instinctively. Outside, the distant horizon over Lake Superior glimmered under the rising sun. Something about the shifting light across the water caught Gavin's attention, almost like a signal reflecting from the direction of the wreck coordinates. Argo remained perfectly still, staring toward the lake as if sensing something unfolding far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Gavin felt the familiar quiet certainty settle in his chest. Events had already begun moving out on the water. The judge adjourned the hearing temporarily, while the evidence was formally submitted for state review. Nora exhaled slowly, relief softening her shoulders for the first time in days. Denise leaned toward her and spoke quietly. "You're protected now. The evidence shifts this case entirely." But even as the courtroom settled into quiet discussion, another operation had already begun miles away on Lake Superior. At the harbor marina, several vehicles belonging to the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, and the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary had gathered near the docks. Leading the environmental response team was Dr. Malcolm Reyes, a marine contamination specialist in his late 40s. Malcolm was a tall, thoughtful man with olive-toned skin, a narrow beard trimmed close along his jawline, and thoughtful brown eyes that carried the calm seriousness of a scientist who had spent decades studying fragile ecosystems. His voice remained steady even in urgent situations. "We move carefully," he instructed his team while examining the coordinates provided by Carter Shaw. "No unnecessary disturbance of the wreck site." Gavin arrived at the harbor shortly after leaving the courthouse. Carter had arranged his involvement as a terrain witness since Gavin had already examined the shoreline markers near the lighthouse. The Coast Guard patrol vessel cut across the lake with steady power, its engines rumbling beneath the steel deck. The sky had grown hazier as wind returned across the water. Visibility dropped slowly as waves built again toward afternoon. When the boat approached the rocky section of shoreline where the wreck coordinates had been marked, Gavin pointed toward the jagged cliffs below the lighthouse. "Landing there," he said. The team disembarked carefully onto the slick rock ledges. Waves crashed nearby, sending bursts of cold spray into the air. Gavin retrieved the old brass signal lantern from his pack. The lantern had once been used by his uncle to guide small boats along the dangerous shoreline before modern navigation lights replaced it. Now, its polished brass frame and caught the dim light as Gavin positioned it on a high rock facing the water. The lantern did not function as a rescue miracle, but as a visual landmark, a fixed point visible through fog or shifting wind. But Carter raised a handheld VHF radio, while another responder prepared a small personal locator beacon, PLB, and signal flare in case the visibility dropped further. The Coast Guard vessel adjusted its position offshore, using the lantern's glow as a reference marker. The wind strengthened suddenly as afternoon storms began forming again along the horizon. Crew members worked quickly to secure safety lines along the rocks. Gavin drove a steel anchor spike between two narrow cracks in the cliffside and attached the main rope. But the gusts were stronger than expected. The rope whipped violently in the wind. Before Gavin could reposition it, Argo stepped forward and planted his paws firmly against the rock beside the anchor line. The Malinois leaned his muscular body into the tension of the rope, acting as a steadying counterweight while Gavin tightened the knot and secured the carabiner to the spike. The dog's posture remained balanced and controlled. His ears flattened slightly against the gusting wind, but his gaze focused entirely on Gavin. One of the Coast Guard responders laughed softly in disbelief. "That dog's holding the line better than half my trainees." The rescue team finally stabilized the rope system long enough to lower a diver safely toward the shallow wreck area below. Within minutes, the diver's radio crackled with confirmation. The damaged container was still present. Chemical sampling equipment was deployed immediately while the Coast Guard vessel maintained position offshore, using the lighthouse lantern as a guide. Up on the rocks, Gavin finally relaxed slightly as the rope system held firm. Argo stepped back beside him, his breathing calm despite the wind. Back in town, Gordon Kessler had attempted to leave the courthouse during the recess, but waiting outside were 2 state investigators and a Coast Guard officer holding sealed documents. Carter Shaw stood nearby as the warrant for environmental endangerment, witness intimidation, and obstruction was formally read. Gordon's confident smile faded slowly as the cuffs closed around his wrists. For the first time since the investigation began, the balance of power had shifted completely. By evening, the storm clouds faded again into pale gold sunlight over Lake Superior. At the lighthouse, Nora stood quietly on the porch while Maya and Eli played near the wooden railing. The children's laughter carried across the rocks for the first time without fear in their voices. Inside the tower, the lighthouse beacon rotated slowly as its bulb warmed to life. Gavin adjusted the final switch and stepped outside. The beam of light swept across the lake, bright and steady. This time the lighthouse was not shining to warn sailors of danger. It was shining to guide them home. Argo lay down beside the porch steps, watching the horizon with patient amber eyes. The wind moved softly through the grass as the children's voices faded into the quiet of evening. For the first time since the storm began days earlier, the night arrived peacefully. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a stranger who chooses to help, through the loyalty of a dog, or through the courage of someone who refuses to give up. Maybe Gavin meeting Nora that day looked like coincidence. But sometimes what we call coincidence may simply be God placing the right people in the same place at the right moment. In our own lives, we all face storms. But even in the darkest moments, God can still place a light along our path to guide us forward. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps wherever life leads you.